On Christmas Eve my husband the CEO demanded, say sorry to his new girlfriend or lose my paycheck and promotion. I said one word. By morning my bags were packed and my London transfer was done. My husband's father turned white. Please say you didn't send those papers. My husband's smile disappeared instantly. Send what papers? Apologize to Victoria. Tonight. At the Christmas party. In front of everyone. I stared at my husband across the mahogany desk in our home office, the personnel action form with my name on it sitting between us like a declaration of war. Robert's voice was flat, emotionless. The same tone he used when firing executives who'd outlived their usefulness. And if I don't? I asked, already knowing the answer. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing these stories of strength and self-worth. If you believe that no one should weaponize their power against those who help them succeed, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how Linda handles this betrayal. Then your salary is suspended. Your promotion is cancelled. And there are documented concerns about your behavior that could lead to termination. He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there wasn't my husband. It was a CEO executing a difficult decision. This doesn't have to be complicated, Linda. Apologize to her and we move forward. Apologize to her. To Victoria Ashford. The 28-year-old Chief Innovation Officer who was sleeping with my husband. The woman whose flawed proposal I'd professionally dismantled at yesterday's board meeting because it would have destroyed everything Morrison Pharmaceuticals stood for. The woman Robert was now protecting at the cost of our 8-year marriage and my career. I looked down at the form again. Salary suspension effective immediately. Postponement of my vice president promotion. The one that was supposed to be announced January 1st. Mandatory public apology for unprofessional conduct towards senior leadership. Something crystallized in that moment. Not heartbreak. I'd already cried those tears 4 months ago when I'd come home early and heard her voice in our bedroom. This was something colder. Clearer. The kind of clarity that only comes when you realize the person you loved has become someone you don't even recognize. Okay, I said quietly. Robert blinked, visibly surprised. He'd been prepared for tears, anger, negotiation. My calm acceptance threw him completely off balance. You'll apologize? He pressed, needing confirmation. I'll handle it, I said, standing up. Not a lie. Not an agreement. Just a promise that I absolutely intended to keep. But I need to explain how we got here. How a marriage that started with so much promise could end with my husband weaponizing corporate policy against me on Christmas Eve. How the woman who'd helped build Morrison Pharmaceuticals into a successful company could be sitting in her own home being threatened with professional destruction by the man she'd once loved. It started 12 years ago, though I didn't recognize the warning signs then. I met Robert in graduate school when I was 26, deep into my PhD in biochemistry. I was spending 16-hour days in labs that smelled like formaldehyde and desperation, running experiments that failed more often than they succeeded, sustained by coffee and the stubborn belief that my research mattered. Robert was finishing his MBA, charismatic, ambitious, full of grand visions about the future. He'd walk into the graduate student lounge where I'd be reviewing research papers, and he'd sit down beside me uninvited, asking questions about my work. Not the polite, glazed-over questions most business students asked when they were trying to seem interested. Real questions. Thoughtful ones. He wanted to understand the science, wanted to know how drug development actually worked beyond the financial models and market analyses. My father runs a pharmaceutical company, he told me during one of those conversations. Small operation. Focuses on rare diseases, pediatric cancers, genetic disorders, conditions that affect thousands of people instead of millions. It's noble work, but it's bleeding money. The big pharmaceutical companies won't touch these diseases because there's no profit in it. Dr. James Morrison had founded Morrison Pharmaceuticals 30 years earlier with a mission that was almost quaint in its idealism. He believed pharmaceutical companies had a moral obligation to develop treatments for patients who were ignored by market forces, who suffered from conditions too rare to justify the massive research and development costs. It was beautiful in theory. In practice, it meant the company existed in a state of perpetual near bankruptcy, sustained more by Dr. Morrison's stubborn refusal to quit than by any rational business model. I want to change that, Robert had said, his eyes bright with conviction. I want to prove you can do well by doing good. That you can save lives and make money. That ethics and profit don't have to be mutually exclusive. I'd believed him. God, I'd believed every word. We got married 8 years ago, right after Robert took over as CEO from his father. Dr. Morrison had stepped back to chairman of the board, ready to let his son take the company in new directions while he maintained oversight. Robert had asked me to join the company as director of strategic planning, using my scientific background to evaluate drug candidates, build partnerships with research institutions, develop frameworks for sustainable growth. We'll do this together, he'd promised on our wedding night. Your science and my business sense. We'll build something extraordinary. And for a while we did. I threw myself into Morrison Pharmaceuticals with the same intensity I'd brought to my doctoral research. I built the strategic planning framework from scratch. Systems for evaluating which rare disease research projects had the best chance of success, which academic partnerships were worth cultivating, how to balance ethical mission with financial sustainability. Within 4 years we'd tripled revenue. We'd secured partnerships with major research hospitals. We'd brought 2 new treatments to market. One for a rare form of pediatric leukemia, another for a genetic blood disorder. These weren't blockbuster drugs that would make us billions, but they were saving children's lives. They were exactly what Morrison Pharmaceuticals had been founded to do. Dr. Morrison loved me for that. He'd introduce me at company events as the smartest person in this organization, and I'm including myself in that assessment. He trusted my judgment on research priorities, valued my opinion on strategic decisions, made me feel like I belonged in ways that had nothing to do with being Robert's wife. Those were good years. We were building something meaningful. Robert and I would work late together, reviewing proposals at the kitchen table, debating priorities, finishing each other's sentences. We felt like partners in every sense of the word. Then success changed things. The Forbes profile came first. 30 under 30 in healthcare. Robert Morrison transforms his father's legacy company. Then the Wall Street Journal feature about young CEOs disrupting pharmaceutical industry conventions. Then the speaking invitations, the board positions at other companies, the attention from venture capitalists who saw Morrison Pharmaceuticals as an acquisition target. Robert started measuring worth by stock price instead of lives saved. He began having lunch with investors who cared only about returns, who asked questions like, "Why are you wasting resources on diseases that affect so few patients?" He'd come home from these meetings energized in ways that made me uncomfortable, talking about optimizing our portfolio and pivoting to higher margin opportunities. "We could be so much bigger," he'd say. "We're limiting ourselves by staying focused on rare diseases. There's a whole market for age management treatments, cosmetic applications of existing compounds. The profit margins are incredible." I'd remind him why his father had started this company, why we'd both chosen this work. The children who were alive because of treatments we'd developed. "I'm not saying we abandon them," Robert would respond, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'm saying we diversify. We use profitable products to fund the noble work. It's just smart business." But I'd seen this story before in the pharmaceutical industry. Companies that started with ethical missions, that promised to use profits from one area to fund research in another. Never worked that way. The profitable products always consumed more resources, demanded more attention, became the primary focus until the original mission was just marketing language on a website nobody read. I became inconvenient. The wife who reminded him of humble beginnings. The scientist who prioritized research integrity over quarterly profits. The voice asking uncomfortable questions about whether we were betraying the mission we'd started with. 6 months ago things shifted in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. Robert started coming home after midnight, smelling like expensive perfume I didn't own. He'd take phone calls in other rooms, his voice dropping to intimate whispers when I walked past. He stopped touching me casually. No more hand on my shoulder when we passed in the hallway, no more kiss on the forehead when I was working late. He stopped asking about my day. Stopped listening when I talked. Stopped seeing me as anything except an obstacle to whatever future he'd convinced himself he was building. I told myself I was being paranoid. That the stress of leadership was affecting him. That successful marriages required understanding and patience. That once we got past this growth phase things would return to how they'd been. I was lying to myself, but confronting the truth felt impossible. Then came the day 4 months ago that shattered every comfortable delusion I'd been clinging to. I'd been at a conference in Boston, 3 days of presentations about breakthrough cancer treatments, networking with researchers whose work could potentially partner with ours. My mind was spinning with possibilities when I decided to come home a day early to surprise Robert. I even stopped at the grocery store buying ingredients for pasta carbonara, the dish I'd perfected during our first year of marriage when we were still people who cooked together, who laughed over kitchen disasters, who had time for each other. I walked into our penthouse carrying groceries and hope, both of which I dropped in the entryway when I heard sounds from our bedroom. Not ambiguous sounds that I could rationalize or reinterpret. Specific sounds. Victoria's voice saying Robert's name in a way that left zero room for misinterpretation. I stood frozen, my mind cataloging details with scientific precision. Her shoes by the door, red-soled Louboutins I recognized from the office. 2 champagne glasses on our coffee table, lipstick stain on one in a shade I'd never wear. Robert's jacket draped over a chair. I backed out quietly. Left the groceries in the hallway. Drove to a hotel where I spent 3 hours crying in a bathroom that smelled like industrial cleaning products. Then I dried my face, looked at myself in the mirror and made a decision. In pharmaceutical research, when a compound shows toxicity in trials, you don't spend years trying to reformulate something fundamentally flawed. You terminate the trial and start over. My marriage was showing toxicity. It was time to terminate and start over. But I didn't confront Robert. I didn't demand explanations or apologies or couples counseling that we both knew wouldn't change anything. Instead, I started planning. The next morning, I called Dr. Morrison and asked about the European expansion he'd mentioned months earlier. The idea of opening a London office to build partnerships with Cambridge and Oxford researchers. Robert doesn't understand the science like you do, Dr. Morrison had said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like disappointment. He's becoming too focused on financials. I need someone in London who remembers why we started this company. I volunteered immediately. For 4 months, I'd been working evenings and weekends building those London relationships. Vetting researchers. Evaluating compounds. Demonstrating my value to an operation 3,000 miles away. And I'd been documenting everything else. Victoria's flawed proposals. Robert's ethical compromises. Company credit card statements showing hotel rooms and jewelry purchases that had nothing to do with business. Not for revenge. For protection. For the inevitable moment when Robert would try to destroy me professionally to protect his affair. Which brought me to yesterday's board meeting where everything finally came to a head. Victoria had presented her grand restructuring proposal. Redirecting 60% of our research budget away from rare disease treatments toward cosmetic anti-aging products. It was filled with buzzwords about high-margin opportunities, and graphs that looked impressive until you examined the underlying assumptions. The science was shallow. The ethics were non-existent. It was everything Morrison Pharmaceuticals had been founded to oppose. I'd spent 3 days preparing a counter-analysis that methodically dismantled every assumption in Victoria's proposal. I'd documented why it would destroy our reputation, alienate research partners, betray our mission. Dr. Morrison had listened to both presentations, then removed his reading glasses with deliberate precision. Linda's analysis is sound. Victoria's proposal has merit for a different kind of company, but it's not who we are. Motion to table indefinitely. The board had agreed unanimously. Victoria's face had gone white, then red. She'd looked at Robert, waiting for him to defend her. He'd said nothing during the meeting. But that night he'd been ice. You humiliated her, he'd said. In front of my father. In front of the board. Which is how I ended up here. Christmas Eve. Sitting across from my husband while he demanded I apologize to his mistress or lose everything I'd built. Okay, I'd said. And I meant it. I would handle this. Just not the way Robert expected. Because in my briefcase locked in my car downstairs, was a folder Dr. Morrison had given me an hour ago. Documents restructuring my role into Managing Director of Morrison Pharmaceuticals Europe. Approved by the board. Filed with the SC. Effective January 2nd. Robert thought okay meant surrender. He was about to learn what it actually meant. I walked out of Robert's office and headed downstairs to where the Christmas party was already in full swing. The penthouse's great room had been transformed into something out of a corporate fantasy. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over marble floors. A string quartet playing something classical that nobody was actually listening to, junior executives in cocktail dresses and dark suits trying to network without appearing too desperate. I needed a drink. Or maybe I needed to leave entirely, get in my car and drive until I hit somewhere that wasn't here. But Dr. Morrison had asked me specifically to attend tonight, and after what he'd done for me, after that folder sitting in my briefcase with documents that would change everything, I owed him at least a few hours of presence. I grabbed champagne from a passing waiter and positioned myself near the windows, watching the snow fall over Manhattan while half listening to conversations about fourth quarter earnings and holiday travel plans. My mind was still in that office upstairs, still processing the conversation that had just happened, still feeling the cold shock of watching my husband weaponize corporate policy against me. Linda. I turned to find Jennifer Chin from Regulatory Affairs standing beside me, concern written across her face. Jennifer and I had worked together for 6 years. She was brilliant, meticulous, and one of the few people in the company who seemed to operate outside the political games that consumed everyone else. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I said, taking a long drink of champagne that tasted too expensive and too cold. Jennifer glanced around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. "It's about Victoria, isn't it? Robert's making you pay for yesterday's board meeting." I looked at her sharply. "How did you?" "Everyone knows," Jennifer interrupted gently. "About Robert and Victoria. About the board meeting. About the fact that you absolutely demolished her proposal with data she couldn't argue against." She paused. "People are taking sides, Linda. And you might be surprised to learn that most of the actual scientists are on yours. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. Robert wants me to apologize to her," I said quietly. "Tonight. In front of everyone. Says my salary is suspended and my promotion is cancelled until I do." Jennifer's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "He can't do that. That's abuse of authority. He's the CEO," I said. "He can do whatever he wants. Dr. Morrison would never." "Dr. Morrison doesn't know yet." I looked at Jennifer carefully, weighing how much to say, how much to trust. "But he will. Soon." Jennifer studied my face, reading something there that made her expression shift from anger to curiosity. "You have a plan." "I have options," I corrected. Before Jennifer could respond, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations quieted, people turned toward the entrance, and I knew without looking that Victoria had arrived. Victoria Ashford was beautiful in the way that stops conversations. Tall, blonde, wearing a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She moved through the room like she owned it, which I supposed she thought she did now that she'd secured the CEO's attention. I'd watched this transformation over the past 6 months, ever since Robert had hired her as Chief Innovation Officer without consulting me despite the obvious overlap with my strategic planning responsibilities. She'd arrived with credentials that looked perfect on paper. Stanford MBA, former consultant at Bain, a TED Talk on disruptive innovation in healthcare that had 2 million views. I'd watched that talk once, forcing myself through 18 minutes of buzzwords and inspirational platitudes that said absolutely nothing of substance if you actually understood pharmaceutical research. But Robert had been mesmerized. I remembered watching him during her interview presentation, seeing something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years when he looked at me. Fascination, desire, that particular thrill of something new and shiny and untested. "We need fresh perspectives," he told me when I'd questioned the hire privately. "New ways of thinking. You're brilliant, Linda, but sometimes you're too focused on the science and not enough on the business." Translation: you care about the mission and that's become inconvenient. I should have fought harder then. Should have insisted on being part of the decision-making process. Should have recognized that Robert was already laying groundwork for my marginalization, choosing someone whose loyalty would be to him rather than to the company's founding principles. But I'd still been trying to be the supportive wife, still believing that questioning his judgment would make me look insecure rather than professionally concerned. Victoria saw me across the room and smiled, bright and sharp and triumphant. She raised her champagne glass in a mock toast that made my stomach turn. "She thinks she's won," Jennifer murmured beside me. "She has won," I said. "At least the battle she thinks we're fighting." "What does that mean?" I drained my champagne and set the empty glass on a nearby table. "It means Victoria is playing checkers while the rest of us are playing chess." 3 months after Victoria's arrival, she'd presented her grand strategic vision to the board. the restructuring proposal that had led directly to yesterday's disaster and tonight's ultimatum. I'd spent 3 days preparing my counteranalysis, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and the growing rage that came from watching someone with minimal pharmaceutical knowledge try to dismantle decades of meaningful work. Victoria's proposal had been full of graphs that looked impressive and buzzwords that meant nothing. Pivoting to high-margin opportunities. Optimizing resource allocation. Leveraging existing compounds for expanded market penetration. What it actually meant was abandoning children with rare genetic disorders in favor of selling anti-aging creams to wealthy consumers who didn't need them. The science was shallow, repurposing existing compounds for cosmetic applications, work that required minimal research but could be marketed at premium prices. The profit margins were undeniably attractive. The ethics were non-existent. I'd documented every flaw in her analysis. The false assumptions about market size. The underestimated costs of regulatory approval for cosmetic products. The complete failure to account for reputational damage when our lead researchers resigned in protest, which they would and which I'd documented with signed statements from 3 department heads. When I'd presented at the board meeting, Victoria's face had gone white, then red. Her voice had gotten sharper and more defensive with each challenge, revealing that she didn't actually understand the science she was proposing to revolutionize. Dr. Morrison had listened to both presentations with that careful attention he brought to everything. When Victoria finished, he'd removed his reading glasses and set them on the table with deliberate precision. Linda's analysis is sound, he'd said quietly. Victoria's proposal has merit for a different kind of company, but it's not who we are. Motion to table indefinitely. The board had agreed unanimously. I should have felt vindication. Instead, I'd felt dread watching Robert's face throughout the meeting, seeing him store every moment of Victoria's humiliation like ammunition he'd use later. Which he had. Less than 24 hours later, in fact. Linda. I turned to find Robert standing beside me, Victoria at his side, her hand possessive on his arm. Up close she was even more striking. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, that particular polish that came from having both money and time to maintain it. Robert, I said evenly. Victoria. We need to talk, Robert said, his voice carrying that flat authority that meant this wasn't a request. I thought we already did, I replied. In your office. About 30 minutes ago. Robert's jaw tightened. I meant all 3 of us. Victoria deserves an explanation for yesterday's. Victoria got an explanation yesterday, I interrupted, looking directly at her. At the board meeting, where I presented data showing why her proposal would damage the company my father-in-law spent 30 years building. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but something cold entered her eyes. It's interesting that you frame it that way. As if protecting outdated business models is the same as protecting the company's future. It's interesting that you think anti-aging creams represent the future of pharmaceutical research, I countered. But then you've never actually worked in pharmaceutical research, have you? Just consulted on it. From the outside. For companies that prioritize profit over patients. Linda. Robert's voice carried a warning. What? I looked at him. Did you want me to apologize now? Here. Is that what this conversation is about? Robert glanced around, noticing that we'd attracted attention, that nearby conversations had gone quiet as people sensed confrontation. Not here, he said tightly. Upstairs. In my office. 5 minutes. He walked away without waiting for confirmation, Victoria following, her red dress a slash of color through the neutral-toned crowd. Jennifer appeared at my elbow. Please tell me you're not going up there alone. I'm not alone, I said quietly. I have everything I need. Linda, he's going to try to force this. In front of her. He's going to make you choose between your dignity and your career. I know, I said. But Jennifer, he doesn't understand what choice I've already made. I touched her arm briefly, grateful for her concern, then headed toward the elevator that would take me back upstairs to Robert's office. Back to the conversation that would end my marriage and begin everything else. The folder in my briefcase felt heavier than it should, full of documents that represented 4 months of quiet preparation, of building relationships Robert knew nothing about, of creating options he didn't know existed. Okay, I'd told him earlier. And I'd meant it. But not in any way he understood. The elevator doors closed and I watched the party disappear below me. All those people celebrating a holiday in a company that was about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. When the doors opened on the executive floor, I could see lights spilling from Robert's office down the hall. I squared my shoulders and walked toward it. Toward the confrontation that had been coming since the day I'd heard Victoria's voice in my bedroom 4 months ago. Toward the moment when OK would transform from apparent surrender into something Robert would spend months trying to understand. Robert's office was exactly as I'd left it 30 minutes earlier. Mahogany desk positioned to dominate the room, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that had probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, everything arranged to project power and control. Victoria was already there, standing near the windows with her champagne glass, looking like she belonged in this space more than I ever had. Robert sat behind his desk in what I'd come to think of as his throne, the leather chair that had been custom-made to his specifications, designed to make him sit slightly higher than anyone across from him. Small psychological games. CEO tricks I'd watched him learn from business books and executive coaching sessions. "Close the door," Robert said when I entered. I closed it, the click echoing louder than it should have in the sudden silence. "Sit," he added, gesturing to one of the chairs facing his desk. I remained standing. A small rebellion, perhaps meaningless, but I'd learned over the past months that sometimes the only power you have left is refusing to make yourself comfortable in your own humiliation. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. He noticed. Of course he noticed. It was one of the things that had made him successful. That attention to detail, that ability to read people and situations and adjust his approach accordingly. "We need to resolve this situation," he said, his voice dropping into that flat, professional tone that made everything sound like a business transaction. "Victoria has expressed concerns about working with you going forward, and frankly, after yesterday's board meeting, I share those concerns." "Concerns," I repeated, the word feeling strange in my mouth. "About me doing my job. About presenting accurate data that contradicted a flawed proposal." Victoria set her champagne glass down with deliberate precision. "Your presentation wasn't about data, Linda. It was about making me look incompetent in front of the board. About undermining my credibility because you see me as a threat." I almost laughed. Almost. Because the sheer audacity of it, her standing in my husband's office, wearing a dress that probably cost more than our researchers earned in a month, accusing me of feeling threatened by her, was so absurd it almost broke through the cold anger that had been building in my chest. "I see you as exactly what you are," I said quietly. "A consultant with an MBA who thinks buzzwords and TED Talks qualify you to revolutionize pharmaceutical research. Someone who's never spent a day in a lab, never evaluated a clinical trial, never had to tell parents that we don't have a treatment for their child's disease because it's not profitable enough for the big companies to bother with. Linda." Robert's voice carried a warning, but I ignored him. "Your proposal would have gutted our rare disease research division. It would have driven away every serious researcher we have. It would have destroyed everything Morrison Pharmaceuticals was founded to do." And yes, I presented data showing exactly that. Because that's my job. Or it was, until apparently doing my job became grounds for disciplinary action. Victoria's face had gone red, her composure cracking. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This hostility. This refusal to consider alternative viewpoints. Robert, you see what I mean, don't you?" Robert stood up, walked around his desk to stand beside Victoria. The gesture was deliberate, choosing his position, making clear whose side he was on. "Linda, you need to understand something," he said. "Victoria is a senior leader in this organization. She reports directly to me. When you undermine her publicly, you undermine my authority and my decision-making. That's not acceptable." "What's not acceptable?" I said, my voice still quiet but carrying an edge now. "Is using your position as CEO to protect your personal relationship at the expense of the company's mission and your wife's career." The words hung in the air like smoke. Robert's face went pale, then flushed. "What are you implying?" he asked, though we all knew exactly what I was implying. "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm stating facts. You hired Victoria without consulting me despite obvious overlap with my responsibilities. You've supported her proposals over the objections of experienced researchers. You're now using HR mechanisms to punish me for presenting data that contradicted her strategy. Either your judgment has been catastrophically compromised, or you're deliberately sabotaging me. Neither option reflects well on your leadership. Victoria made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. This is incredible. Robert, she's actually accusing you of professional misconduct because she can't accept that her approach is outdated and her attitude is toxic. My approach saved the company from a strategic disaster, I shot back. Your approach would have turned us into just another cosmetics company chasing profit margins while children with rare diseases continue to suffer because no one will develop treatments for them. Enough. Robert's voice cut through the argument with CEO authority. This is exactly the problem, Linda. This inability to collaborate. This need to be right at everyone else's expense. This is why we're here. He walked back to his desk, opened a drawer and pulled out the personnel action form I'd seen earlier. He laid it on the desk between us like evidence at a trial. This is effective immediately, he said, and his voice had gone completely flat now, emotionless in that way that meant he'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. Your salary is suspended pending resolution of documented concerns about your professional conduct. Your promotion to vice president is postponed indefinitely. And you're required to issue a public apology to Victoria acknowledging that your approach at yesterday's board meeting was inappropriate. I stared at the form, reading the words again even though I'd already seen them. Unprofessional conduct towards senior leadership. Failure to demonstrate collaborative approach. Concerns regarding judgment and team dynamics. Corporate language designed to sound objective while meaning whatever the person wielding it wanted it to mean. This is retaliation, I said quietly. Using company policy to punish me for challenging Victoria's proposal. Using your authority as CEO to protect your, I paused, choosing my words carefully, professional relationship with her. This is accountability, Robert countered. For behavior that multiple people have documented as problematic. Multiple people, I repeated. You mean Victoria? Who documented concerns after I contradicted her at a board meeting. That's not multiple people. That's one person with a vested interest in discrediting me. There are other complaints, Robert said. From researchers who felt bullied by your management style. From colleagues who've experienced your dismissive attitude toward ideas that don't align with your vision. This was news to me. Researchers complaining about me. I'd spent 8 years building relationships with our research teams, defending their work, fighting for resources they needed. The idea that they'd complained about me felt like fiction. Unless Robert was simply making it up. Creating a paper trail to justify what he was about to do. Show me the documentation, I said. These complaints from researchers. I want to see them. That's part of the HR investigation, Robert said. You'll have access to relevant materials through the proper channels. In other words, you can't show me because they don't exist. In other words, there are proper procedures that we're following. Robert's voice was getting harder now, frustrated that I wasn't simply accepting this. Linda, I'm trying to handle this professionally. I'm giving you a chance to resolve this without it escalating further. All you need to do is acknowledge that your approach was inappropriate and commit to better collaboration going forward. Better collaboration, I said. Meaning I should support Victoria's proposals even when they're fundamentally flawed. Meaning I should stay quiet when I see strategic mistakes being made. Meaning I should prioritize protecting egos over protecting the company's mission. Meaning you should treat senior leadership with respect. Victoria interjected. Meaning you should find ways to express concerns that don't involve humiliating people in front of the board. Meaning you should recognize that you're not the only person in this company with valuable insights. I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to understand what she actually wanted. Was this about professional ambition? About securing her position by eliminating someone she saw as competition? Or was it something more personal? Proving to herself, to Robert, to everyone that she'd won, that she'd successfully replaced me in every aspect of his life? Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe people's motivations were never as simple as we wanted them to be. I'm not apologizing, I said, turning back to Robert. Not to her, not to you, not to anyone. I presented accurate data at a board meeting using appropriate professional channels. If Victoria is embarrassed by having her proposal rejected, that's a consequence of submitting a flawed proposal, not of me being unprofessional. Robert's jaw tightened. Then the suspension stands. And if you continue to refuse, we'll have to consider whether your position here is viable at all. Are you threatening to fire me? I asked, my voice still calm despite everything. On Christmas Eve? While we're hosting a party downstairs. I'm explaining consequences, Robert said. Actions have consequences, Linda. You can't undermine leadership and expect no response. I thought about the folder in my briefcase downstairs. About Dr. Morrison's documents restructuring my role, transforming me from Robert's subordinate into someone who reported directly to the board. About 4 months of quietly building relationships in London, demonstrating my value to an operation Robert knew nothing about. About the choice I'd already made before I'd even walked into this office. You're right, I said. Actions do have consequences. You're about to learn that. Robert frowned, uncertain again, that crack in his confidence widening slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not the person you seem to think I am, I said. The person who'll accept humiliation to keep a job. The person who'll apologize for being right because it makes you uncomfortable. The person who'll stay in a company where the CEO uses his authority to protect his affair at his wife's expense. You need to be very careful about what you're implying, Robert said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. I'm not implying anything, I said again. I'm simply stating that I won't be apologizing to Victoria. I won't be accepting this suspension. And I won't be staying in a position where my professional judgment is weaponized against me because it conflicts with your personal interests. Victoria laughed, sharp and brittle. So what, you're just going to quit? Walk away from everything you've built here? Because that's what happens when you refuse to be a team player, Linda. You isolate yourself. You end up with nothing. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I end up with something better. Something that doesn't require compromising my integrity or watching the mission I believed in get dismantled for profit margins and ego. I turned toward the door, done with this conversation, done with trying to make them understand something they had no interest in understanding. Linda. Robert's voice stopped me at the threshold. If you walk out of here without agreeing to these terms, there's no coming back. This is your last chance to handle this the easy way. I looked back at him, at this man I'd married 12 years ago when I still believed love and ambition could coexist without destroying each other. Hey, I said. The same word I'd said earlier. The word he'd taken as surrender. But this time I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he'd miscalculated something fundamental. I'll handle this, I added. Tonight. At the party. You'll get your answer. Then I walked out, leaving them standing in that office, probably already congratulating themselves on winning a battle they didn't understand they'd just lost. The war was over before they even knew it had started. I walked out of Robert's office for the second time that night and took the elevator back down to the party. My hands were steady as I pressed the button, my breathing calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The elevator descended smoothly, each floor taking me further from the confrontation upstairs and closer to the moment that would change everything. When the doors opened, the party was still in full swing. The string quartet had been replaced by a DJ playing something with a careful balance between festive and professional. Junior analysts were dancing now, emboldened by champagne and the temporary suspension of workplace hierarchies that company parties created. I found Dr. Morrison near the windows where I'd left him earlier, watching the snow fall over Manhattan with the particular stillness of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize pivotal moments when they arrived. It's done, I said quietly, standing beside him. He didn't ask what I meant. He'd known this was coming from the moment he'd handed me that folder. You're sure about London? He asked instead. Once you make this announcement, there's no walking it back. Robert will. He paused, choosing his words carefully. My son will not handle this well. I know, I said. But staying would destroy me. Slowly, methodically, one small humiliation at a time until I couldn't remember who I was before I became someone who accepted being treated like this. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly, something like pride crossing his weathered face. Your flight is Monday morning? 6 a.m. out of JFK. I land at Heathrow Tuesday evening, London time. The apartment in Shoreditch should be ready by Wednesday. The team is excited, Dr. Morrison said. Marcus has already started reaching out to his Cambridge contacts. Elena has set up introductions with 3 Oxford research groups for your first week. David has the budget projections ready for review. I'd been working with that London team for 4 months through video calls and email exchanges, building relationships while my marriage disintegrated and Robert grew increasingly hostile. They felt more like colleagues than anyone in the New York office had in years. People who valued competence over politics, who cared about the work itself rather than using it as a stepping stone to somewhere else. "Thank you," I said to Dr. Morrison, meaning it for so much more than just the job. For seeing what Robert was becoming. For giving me a way out that isn't just running away. "You earned this," he said firmly. "The London position isn't a favor or a rescue mission. It's recognition that you're the best person to build what we need in Europe. Robert will eventually understand that. Or he won't. But either way, it won't change the fact that you've earned this opportunity through merit." The music shifted to something slower, more contemplative. I watched executives drift toward the bar for refills, saw Victoria emerge from the elevator and scan the room until her eyes found Robert, who'd appeared moments after her. Their faces were tight, uncertain. Whatever confidence they'd felt upstairs had been replaced by something else. Concern maybe, or the beginning of understanding that the situation wasn't as controlled as they'd thought. Robert's eyes found mine across the room. For a moment we just looked at each other. Husband and wife, CEO and Director of Strategic Planning, two people who'd once believed they were building something together and had somehow ended up as adversaries in a corporate drama neither of us had wanted. Then he started walking toward me, Victoria close behind, and I knew the time had come. Dr. Morrison touched my arm briefly. "Good luck, Linda. Though I don't think you'll need it." I waited until Robert was close enough that I wouldn't have to shout, but far enough that other people would hear what I was about to say. The conversations around us quieted as people sensed something significant was happening. "I have something to say," I announced, my voice carrying across the great room with more steadiness than I felt. The music stopped. The DJ, reading the room with professional instinct, killed the track mid-beat. In the sudden silence, every person at Morrison Pharmaceuticals' Christmas party turned to look at me. Robert's face showed satisfaction. He thought he'd won, thought I'd bent to his ultimatum, thought I was about to publicly apologize to Victoria and cement his control over both his company and his personal life. Victoria's smile was radiant, triumphant. She raised her champagne glass in a small gesture that looked celebratory to anyone watching but that I knew was mocking. A private acknowledgement that she'd taken everything that had been mine and I was about to acknowledge her victory publicly. I looked at both of them, these people who'd thought they could corner me, force my compliance, make me choose between dignity and survival. "I'm resigning from my position as Director of Strategic Planning," I said clearly, watching Robert's satisfaction drain into confusion. "Effective immediately. I've accepted the role of Managing Director for Morrison Pharmaceuticals Europe. I'll be relocating to London next week to oversee our expansion there." The silence deepened, changed quality. Confusion rippled through the room. People exchanged glances, trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Robert's face went white, then red. "You can't. That position doesn't exist. I haven't authorized any." "The board authorized it 2 weeks ago," I interrupted, keeping my voice calm and professional. "Dr. Morrison signed off personally. It's already been filed with the SEC. I'm surprised you didn't see the paperwork, Robert. But then you've been quite distracted lately." That last part was petty, perhaps, but I allowed myself the small satisfaction of watching him realize that everyone in this room now understood exactly what I was implying. Dr. Morrison stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the windows. "Robert, perhaps we should discuss this in private." "No." Robert's voice was sharp, almost desperate. "Linda, you can't just leave. We have projects there are responsibilities. That need someone who understands the science," I finished for him. "Someone who cares about the mission. I'll be doing exactly that work in London. Everything's already arranged. Housing, visa, team structure. I start January 2nd. I turned to Victoria, gave her the coldest smile I could manage. "Congratulations on your promotion to Director of Strategic Planning. I'm sure you'll do wonderfully. I've left detailed transition notes in my office. You'll need them." Victoria's face had gone pale. She'd expected humiliation, mine, not hers. She'd expected validation, public acknowledgement that she'd won, that she'd successfully replaced me in every aspect of Robert's life. Instead, she was being handed a job she wasn't qualified for, in front of everyone who knew she wasn't qualified for it, as the woman she'd tried to destroy walked away with dignity intact. I started toward the exit, my head high, my heart pounding but my expression serene. "Linda, wait," Robert's voice cracked slightly. "We need to talk about this. You can't just—" I paused at the door, looked back at the room full of executives watching this corporate drama unfold. My eyes found Dr. Morrison, who gave me the slightest nod of approval. "Okay," I said, using the same word I'd given Robert twice already tonight. The word he'd taken as surrender. In this context, in front of all these witnesses, it meant something entirely different. It meant, "Okay, I'm done. Okay, I choose myself. Okay, you're about to discover what happens when you mistake silence for weakness." Then I walked out into the December night, into the snow that was falling harder now, into the first moments of my new life. Behind me, I heard Robert's voice, loud with panic. "Dad, please tell me she didn't file the succession documents. Please tell me you didn't sign off on equity restructuring without consulting me." Dr. Morrison's response was quiet but carried in the sudden silence. "I consulted with the board, Robert. That's all the consultation required. Perhaps you should have paid more attention to what your wife was building instead of—" A deliberate pause. "Other concerns." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I had 36 hours until my flight to London, a hotel room near JFK waiting for me, and the beginning of a future that was finally entirely mine. The snow was cold against my face as I walked to where I'd parked my car. My phone was already buzzing with texts and calls, but I ignored them all. There would be time for logistics and explanations and the administrative dismantling of a marriage. But tonight I just needed to feel this. The weight lifting from my chest, the possibility opening before me, the understanding that I'd chosen myself over everything else and the sky hadn't fallen. I'd survived. More than survived. I'd won, though not in any way Robert or Victoria would understand. I'd won by refusing to play their game. By building something they didn't know existed until it was too late to stop it. By saying okay and meaning something completely different from what they'd heard. I got in my car and drove toward JFK, toward the hotel room where I'd spend Christmas morning, toward London and a team who didn't know about affairs or betrayals or marriages ending in penthouse offices. Toward a life where I could just be Linda again. Where my work would be judged on merit rather than politics. Where I wouldn't have to fight for space in my own marriage or dignity in my own company. The Manhattan skyline receded in my rearview mirror, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by snow and distance. And I felt nothing but relief. The hotel room near JFK was exactly what you'd expect from corporate lodging: beige walls, generic landscape prints, a bed that was comfortable enough but forgettable. I checked in just after midnight on Christmas Eve, still wearing the emerald silk dress from the party, my suitcases already packed and waiting in the car. I should have felt something dramatic. Grief, maybe, or rage, or the kind of cathartic relief that comes from finally escaping something toxic. Instead, I just felt tired and oddly empty, like I'd been holding my breath for months and had finally exhaled but didn't quite know what to do with the space that created. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd left the party. I'd turned off the sound, but the screen kept lighting up with notifications. Texts, calls, voicemails accumulating like evidence of the chaos I'd left behind. 23 calls from Robert. 18 from Victoria. 6 from various executives. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I ordered room service, a club sandwich I barely touched, and spent Christmas Eve reviewing documents for London, trying to focus on the future rather than the wreckage of the past. Christmas morning, I woke early and called Dr. Morrison. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Linda. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine,"